This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
Good evening. My name is Bob Gregg. I'm the director of the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies here at Stanford. The Abbasi program is the sponsor of tonight's talk, along with our friends from the Muslim Student Awareness Network, who also pitched in our efforts for tonight. Among our number tonight are Sohaib and Sarah Abbasi, and we are very grateful to them for their pivotal support of the study of Islam, Muslims, and Muslim societies. They are here. Yeah, perfectly. Most of you have in recent days read or heard of discussions taking place among President Obama and his advisors about conflict in Afghanistan and Pakistan, troop increases, and questions of strategy regarding the Taliban. We are fortunate to have as our speaker tonight Ahmed Rashid, whose work as a journalist, news analyst, and accomplished author makes him the keenest observer of things done, things left undone, and things still needing to be done in this embattled region. Winner in 2001 of the Nisar Osman Award for Courage in Journalism given by the Human Rights Society of Pakistan, he is the author of several important books, including his bestseller, Taliban, Militant Islam, Oil, and Fundamentalism in Central Asia, a book called Jihad, The Rise of Militant Islam in Central Asia. He is also the author of a December article in Foreign Affairs Journal, A Regional Strategy for the Obama Administration. His most recent work, published last year, owns a place in the middle of current discussions. It is entitled Descent into Chaos, the United States and the Failure of Nation Building in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. We shall have a chance for questions and answers at the conclusion of this evening's talk. Ending Chaos in Afghanistan and Pakistan, a New Direction in U.S. Foreign Policy. Please welcome our guest, Ahmed Rashid. Just a couple of
Well, thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'd really like to thank Mr. and Mrs. Abbasi and all the staff who are working with that program, and it's great that you have this opportunity. I was last year just before 9/11, where I talked to the Hoover Institute, I remember, but it's a very great pleasure to be, back on the campus and to see all of you. Let me just start by saying there's a lot of criticism already of President Obama about sending more troops to Afghanistan, and you've probably seen headlines like Obama's Vietnam and how the US faces defeat in Afghanistan like the Soviet Union, and going back to the British period, etc. So I hope that my talk will be offer some encouragement to I think what can be done in Afghanistan and Pakistan, although Pakistan today is probably a much more difficult place to have a new policy than even perhaps Afghanistan. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the situation as to why Afghanistan and Pakistan are so important. We're going to look at the inheritance of the last 7 years briefly, the Bush administration and what it did or didn't do. And then I'll go into the policy changes that I hope and expect from the Obama administration. And then briefly we'll look at the regional solution. Let me just start by saying the President himself has said just 2 days ago that the US is not winning in Afghanistan. And that implies very strongly what most Afghans think, that the Taliban are winning in Afghanistan. So certainly the situation is very explosive in Afghanistan. And the main reason is that you've had, first of all, the resurgence of the Taliban, which restarted in 2003, and the Taliban have now become a model for the whole region. We have today Pakistani Taliban, Afghan Taliban, and Central Asian Taliban, militants from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, from the Caucasus, from Chechnya, who are today fighting with the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban, and certainly plan to go back home and replicate their cause. So the whole region is seeing very serious deterioration on all fronts. The one result of this has been the collapse of development and the aid and reconstruction process in Afghanistan. The UN, NGOs, the aid agencies are not able to work in something like a third of Afghanistan right now because of the Taliban insurgency. So the less they can work, the more rapidly they lose the hearts and minds of the Afghan population. Thirdly, there is a growing global terrorist threat from this expansion of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, especially in Europe. Before 9/11, I'd like to remind you that Al-Qaeda did not have branches in most European countries. But today, they have branches in almost every single European country. There have been large-scale arrests just in the last 6 months in Germany, in Denmark, in Spain, in France, of new Al-Qaeda groups or neo-Al-Qaeda groups that have been supporting Al-Qaeda. In Pakistan, there was tremendous hope generated by the elections last year after the tragic death of Benazir Bhutto. And there was a hope that the People's Party government, that her party that won the elections, would put together a government of national reconciliation and rebuilding. And unfortunately, that has not happened. We are faced now in Pakistan with three monumental crises which are really creating the perfect storm. The first is the very rapid spread of the Pakistani Taliban across northern Pakistan. Most recently with what you've seen, the capturing of the Swat Valley, and which is very close to Islamabad, and the concessions being given by the government towards the Taliban in a ceasefire that they have struck there. The second crisis is an economic crisis. Pakistan is literally bankrupt. We are surviving on an IMF loan for the last 6 months. But the incredible chaos at the moment, that there is an appeal for international donor help. That's going to be very difficult with the present economic crisis that the world is going through, and the international community is not seeing the kind of political leadership which would take ownership of large chunks of foreign aid and foreign money, and nor are they seeing the mechanisms of accountability and transparency. The Pakistan economic crisis is not related so much to the global economic crisis. It predates that. And one of the reasons the government did not address that much earlier when it came into power in March of last year was because it almost immediately became embroiled in an interscene political struggle with the leading opposition figure, Nawaz Sharif. And this has kept the pot boiling and completely diverted the attention of the Pakistani authorities from dealing either with terrorism or the economy. And right now there's a full-scale crisis on in that Nawaz Sharif is now threatening to topple the government. He's going to march on Islamabad in the middle of March, joining the lawyers' movement and other movements of civil society, in order to reinstate the former Chief Justice who was ousted by President Musharraf, but basically in order to topple the government. So in Pakistan you have a Taliban a problem, an economic crisis, and a very acute political confrontation. All these events in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the fact that they are all linked also to the revamping of the global terrorist threat in Europe and in even possibly in the United States, makes this region incredibly important. Certainly, President Obama has said that this region presents the most challenging foreign policy issue, I think, for this administration. Now, very briefly, I mean, I'm not going to go into great detail, but I think we do need to to touch upon, how did we get from 9/11 to here? How did we get from the enormous hope and that was generated after the ousting of the Taliban to a situation where the Taliban have come back in Afghanistan and they have now becoming a really potent threat in Pakistan and in Central Asia? Well, I'm going to list a number of things. You'll find this in much more detail in my book, Descent into Chaos. But let me just say, if in one word you want to know why the US has failed in Afghanistan, that one word is Iraq. Iraq was an enormous diversion of resources and money and effort and everything that was promised for Afghanistan, unfortunately, ended up in Iraq. And nobody can say that Iraq has been an astounding success story because, unfortunately, many of the mistakes that were made in Afghanistan by the Americans between 2001 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003 were repeated again in Iraq. It didn't seem that the Americans learned the lessons of rebuilding countries, etc., from Afghanistan, and they were repeated in Iraq. Now, in Afghanistan, simply, there was no comprehensive military strategy by the Bush administration for securing or stabilizing Afghanistan. It was an ad hoc strategy that was that deployed the minimum number of troops, because most of the troops were, going to Iraq, the smallest amount of resources, and the real window of opportunity in Afghanistan, which was between 2002 and 2004, when the Taliban insurgency really takes off. That window of opportunity was completely wasted. The whole focus of the US was to prepare for the war in Iraq, and as such, security went bad, the economic issues which needed to be addressed, most importantly, the rebuilding of the Afghan infrastructure, roads, electricity, water, which could have kick-started the Afghan economy, which could have provided jobs for the people, which could have provided some of the, fulfilled some of the expectations that the Afghans had, were not fulfilled. There was no comprehensive nation-building strategy. In fact, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and President Bush were really against any long-term strategic rebuilding of Afghanistan in economic and social terms, at least until 2005, when the US does, in the second term, does get more serious because they realize that the situation is deteriorating. And when I say nation-building strategy, I mean not just economic development, but also the rebuilding of the state structure, at least a minimal state structure which existed before the Soviet invasion. That is why the rebuilding of the Afghan army, the Afghan police, the Afghan justice system, the administration, all started very late. The first 2 or 3 years were completely wasted. There was no coherent drug strategy, counter-narcotic strategy, as a result of which Afghanistan today, as you know, provides 93% of the world's heroin. Heroin is today one of the main financial providers for the Taliban resurgence and for Al-Qaeda and for these operations abroad that they are launching. Only last year did there were two basic problems with the drugs problem. One was to deal with eradication of the poppy crop on the ground, and the other was to deal with interdiction. And a lot of experts were advising people, were telling the Bush administration that the US military should get involved in interdiction. That meant seizing convoys of drugs that were literally passing in front of US soldiers' eyes. I saw that myself several times in Afghanistan, and capturing some of the big traffickers. But there was no, Rumsfeld was very much against it, so was the vice president, and there was no involvement of the US military. Only last year, at the fag end of the Bush administration, has the US military committed itself to do interdiction. They're now trying to convince the NATO countries who are in Afghanistan to help the US and do the same thing. But really, this has come out as a result of, and of course, the Bush administration was also in total denial that drugs money was being used to fuel extremism. For many years, again, experts were pointing out that this was the case, but for many years, the administration was in total denial about this. In Pakistan, there was a very much more complicated picture. But crucially in Pakistan, the Pakistan military regime, which was in office throughout that period, was essentially running a dual policy. It was supporting the US as far as Al-Qaeda was catching Al-Qaeda, and that was basically it. But at the same time, it was giving refuge and sanctuary to the Afghan Taliban leadership. Almost the entire Afghan Taliban leadership migrated to Pakistan. And again, you had the Bush administration for many years turning a completely a blind eye to this. Even though the US military in Afghanistan, senior generals were pointing out to the Pentagon and to Washington that this was the case, and that as long as these sanctuaries were operable in Pakistan, the Taliban were able to get new recruits, they were able to get logistics, food, ammunition, money, support, etc. They were able to travel to the Middle East to raise donations for their cause. And so this dual strategy has really now caught us by the gullet, because the problem in Pakistan was that when the Taliban and Al-Qaeda escaped from Afghanistan into the Pakistan border regions, the leadership there was hosted largely by the Pashtun tribes along the border in Balochistan province and the Northwest Frontier province. And it was very clear, even in 2003, that if you are going to allow this to happen, the hosts, in other words, the Pakistani Pashtun tribes, would become radicalized, which they have become, would become militant, as they have become, and finally develop their own agenda. And what we saw after 2004 was the development of the Pakistani Taliban, which partly they were being used by the Afghans to fight in Afghanistan against the Americans, but partly they started developing their own agenda. And that agenda was to Talibanize Pakistan, to create first a Pakistani Taliban safe area in northern Pakistan, and then to slowly Talibanize the whole Pakistani state. And unfortunately, that movement has now really taken off in a big way. The Pakistani Taliban are now determined to topple the government. And we've seen these terrorist attacks in Lahore recently and in other cities. The Pakistani Taliban have been able to link up with a lot of groups that were fighting previously in Kashmir and were at a loose end since there was a peace process between India and Pakistan after 2004. So you have a combination now of rural Pashtun tribesmen who constitute the Pakistani Taliban, linking up with educated urban terrorist groups inside the cities of Pakistan, especially in Punjab province, and even in Karachi and in other major cities. And this symbiosis is creating enormous leverage for militancy in Pakistan, perhaps much more so than even in Afghanistan. The second thing was that the military regime was really not intent on transferring power to some kind of democratic setup, and constantly backpedaled. And as we know, in the last 18 months of Musharraf's regime, there was a civil society movement by lawyers and by NGOs and by women's groups and all sorts of people to get rid of the military regime and to allow a return of democracy. And there was the Bush administration continued to support Musharraf far beyond his due date, as it were. And that created more anti-Americanism in Pakistan. That created enormous resentment, against the US, and also, of course, enormous resentment against the military regime. Now, finally, I think one of the strategic mistakes, again, made by the Bush administration was that after 9/11, there was this dependence on one country, one ally in the entire region to help the US fight in Afghanistan, and that was Pakistan. The fact is, Afghanistan is a landlocked country. It has 6 neighbors, and most of these neighbors were not properly involved in helping stabilize Afghanistan. And until there was a regional strategy, these neighbors had been critical in fueling the civil war in Afghanistan in the 1990s. If you remember, Pakistan was backing the Taliban, India and Iran, and the Central Asians were backing, and Russia were backing the Northern Alliance. And this regional rivalry had once again become very, very pronounced. The US had bases in Central Asia, but they had no political strategy in order to bring the Central Asian regimes into the process of helping stabilize Afghanistan. Of course, the US had no relations with Iran. Iran is a critical factor in helping Afghanistan, and so of course, that didn't help. And the situation with Iran worsened much more when there were threats of invading Iran 2 years ago in the second part of the Bush administration. So the regional issue has become more pronounced, in the last few years, and much more dangerous. And I'll try and talk about that a bit later. So what is the Obama administration, now really faced with in both Afghanistan and Pakistan? It has first inherited a very grim and bitter legacy in which the Taliban have expanded. There has been economic collapse in these two important countries. The region itself is in great turmoil and taking sides in this conflict. Anti-Americanism has reached new heights, especially in Pakistan, but certainly also in Afghanistan, which has given the Taliban the kind of leverage that it has always wanted. So we have, a very difficult, problematic situation. Now, as you know, the Obama administration is now putting together a policy for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it has to be ready by April 2nd when the NATO summit will take place. And so let me just briefly talk about the things that they have done and that they plan to do. First of all, I think it is, we've seen some steps. We've seen the closure of Guantanamo, although the repercussions of that are very complicated legally, and exactly what's going to happen, nobody really knows. But I think the first thing is that the whole Bush concept of the global war on terror, which lumps together all Islamic groups, no matter who they're fighting against or for, into one kind of global jihad, which is aimed at the United States, was patently false and patently a huge detriment to any kind of splitting off or trying to win over elements of the resurgence. So what happened was that, for example, after 9/11, a lot of Taliban were not willing to fight. They had been defeated. They were quite happy to go home. But they were faced with this, any Taliban were going to be arrested, along with Al-Qaeda and along with other things. So what is clearly needed for this administration is to redefine what is Islamic extremism and what is the global jihad and global terrorism. Now, clearly, Al-Qaeda have a global agenda. They have a global agenda both in the Muslim world and in the West. And that agenda has not changed. It has become, in fact, perhaps more clearly defined with what they've been trying to carry out terrorist attacks in Europe. Al-Qaeda today has expanded in North Africa. There's now an Al-Qaeda in North Africa. They've expanded in Somalia, in Sudan, in Yemen. The one setback that they may have faced recently has been in Iraq because of a much better counterinsurgency strategy that has been followed by American forces in Iraq. But overall, Al-Qaeda's reach and Al-Qaeda's appeal has not been diminished, in these intervening years. And the fact that so many other groups were kind of lumped together with Al-Qaeda, basically the Taliban, Kashmiri militants, and even in the Middle East, Hamas, Hezbollah have all been kind of labeled with this global war on terror label. So I think the first thing is that they have to split apart. Certainly there is Al-Qaeda, and then there are, if you like, Islamic extremist groups who do not have a global agenda. The Taliban do not want to put a bomb in New York. They're not fighting to overthrow the American administration. They're fighting wars in the region in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but their aims are limited. And I think by redefining this, there will be the opportunity, and the same goes for the Middle East, of course, with groups like Hamas. I think by defining this, there is going to be, there is the intention of this administration to talk to some of these groups, or to talk to elements in these groups who do have a local agenda, who are locally upset with American policy or the local regime, but are not necessarily part of the global jihad, and in fact are quite fed up with the Arab component of the global jihad and want to de-link themselves from it. So I hope that this is going to be one of the key facets of Obama's policy. This is going to be probably one of the key facets of his speech to the Muslim world when he gives it, and that he's promised to give. I think that is the key thing. And we've heard, day before yesterday, repeatedly that he has said that he wants to talk to the Taliban. Now, I don't think that that is a bad idea. A lot of Taliban in Afghanistan and in Pakistan are there for a variety of reasons. Their house has been destroyed, their brother was killed, they're fighting for money because, the Taliban are now paying their soldiers. In the 1990s, when I first studied the Taliban, nobody paid the Taliban soldiers. They were there gratis, as it were. And now they're getting salaries which are almost twice the normal salary of a Pakistani worker or an Afghan worker. So I think that, there is an opportunity there. Secondly, there has been a lot of talk about the troop surge. 17,000 more troops are going, and the American military has asked for even more troops in Afghanistan. Well, I think what is needed is not a troop surge. What is going to be needed is a comprehensive surge. And when I say, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the aid and development and reconstruction and building the infrastructure and providing capacity in the Afghan government to carry out some of its tasks, pushing it further in trying to deal with corruption, to deal with drugs. This all has to be part of a comprehensive strategy. Now, you're going to have to need troops because the Taliban have taken over so much of southern and eastern Afghanistan that the Taliban have to be rolled back. These areas have to be made secure. And then behind the foreign troops have to come Afghan troops and also the development agencies to carry out reconstruction and development, etc. The kinds of things that were promised by the Bush administration 7 years ago, but were never delivered. So I hope there will be a policy that will reflect a more comprehensive surge, so that we're not just talking about more troops going in and looking at this in a totally military fashion, which was what was basically the policy of the previous administration. What we'll be looking at is a more comprehensive strategy. Thirdly, I think the counterinsurgency doctrine that has been finally, I think, learned by the American military in Iraq really needs to be applied to Afghanistan. And in that, the central part of that is that counterinsurgency doctrine has to be people-centric rather than terrorism-centric. In other words, you have to win the hearts and minds of the people. Now, how do you do that? General Petraeus is, a famous byline of, clear, hold, and build. That is, clear the insurgents out, hold an area, stabilize the area, provide security for the area's population, and then be able to bring in development agencies, etc., to build. That is needed, and troops are needed for that, because troops are needed to clear the Taliban out, and then troops are needed also to hold that area. The tragedy of the too few troops syndrome in Afghanistan has been that troops have gone in for short periods of time and then come out again. Well, immediately they do that, the population is again held hostage by the Taliban. The Taliban have come back. So clearly what is needed is a counterinsurgency strategy which protects the people, gives security to the people, so that the local economy can take off. Fourthly, I will repeat that now there is a policy on drugs, on interdiction at least. I hope the US military is going to pursue this vigorously, because the Afghan government does not have the capacity to do this in most areas of the country at the moment, and I hope NATO is going to follow suit. There are 40 NATO countries with troops, there are 40 countries with troops in Afghanistan. Some 26 of them are NATO countries, the rest are other allies. So there is a very large international commitment to Afghanistan, and these other forces also have to do interdiction to deal with the drugs issue. But the drugs issue is essentially going to be fought through development and investment in agriculture. You know, I mean, investment in agriculture is one of the saddest stories of all in Afghanistan. 70 or 80% of Afghans were rural in, 2001. And there was not really, almost nothing was given for investment in agriculture in that crucial opening window of opportunity that existed in the beginning. If that had happened, if new crops, new seeds, roads to market roads, rebuilding the water supply, et cetera, had been done, you wouldn't have had this kind of poppy explosion. Now, and lastly, this year there will be presidential elections in Afghanistan. At the moment, the country is facing a very severe constitutional crisis because it's a complicated thing, but the president has to term ends. Karzai's term ends on May 22nd. He has, the elections cannot be held until August because it's going to take that long for more troops to arrive and to secure, provide stability and security for the elections to happen. And the whole debate between the opposition and Karzai is what happens in that intervening period between May and August. The opposition is demanding that Karzai step down and an interim government come into place and a neutral government which will hold free and fair elections. Karzai is determined to stay on. But I think, the big difference is that previously, I mean, we've had constitutional crises before in Afghanistan, especially in 1992, and invariably they were resolved not by any kind of dialogue or political accommodation, but by the power of the gun, with one side attacking the other. So far that has not happened, and it's not likely to happen, and I hope that this will be resolved in an amicable and political way. So I think the Obama options in Afghanistan, I think, are simply going to be helped by the fact that the majority of the Afghan population does not want the Taliban back. Now, the gains which have been made by the Taliban have been made as a result of, first, a huge number of mistakes by the previous administration, the lack of security in troops, but also by the horrific campaigns that the Taliban have launched, creating terror and fear and literally terrorizing people. Now, right now, for example, in southern Afghanistan, in 3 provinces, the Taliban are demanding that every family provide 1 male member for the Taliban military force. Now, that's exactly what they were doing in the 1990s, forced conscription. Now, this is not something that, families want to do. But families are being forced to do it. And of course, you have read the stories of the suicide bombings, the beheadings, acid being thrown into girls' faces, the blowing up of girls' schools. So in many ways, Taliban tactics have in fact become far more aggressive and horrific than they ever were in the 1990s when they were fighting the Northern Alliance. So I think, the goodwill of the Afghan people is still there. That is, and they believe that as long as foreign forces are in Afghanistan, there is still the hope that somebody is going to help change our lives. Somebody is going to rebuild our country. Somebody is going to help us. So I don't think that there is a mass movement to get rid of foreign troops in Afghanistan. I think there's a lot of anger with the Americans. There's a lot of frustration with the Americans, the way they behave, the lack of, fulfilling what they had promised. But basically, I think the Afghan population would still like to see the international community committed to Afghanistan. Now, so I think, if there is a coherent, comprehensive strategy for Afghanistan, which can be, which would be adopted by the international community, but particularly by NATO, I think we will see progress. But it's going to be a long haul because so much ground has been lost in the last 8 years. Now, the situation in Pakistan, in fact, is much more complicated. And the options for the Obama administration are actually far fewer. The Obama administration is at the moment pursuing its counterterrorism strategy is basically based on these missile attacks that it's launching against the leadership of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban that it finds in the tribal areas along the border with Afghanistan. One of the reasons, for example, the militants have now moved to the Swat Valley, which is well inland, is that a lot of the leadership is going to move to the Swat Valley in the hope that the Americans are not going to be able to bomb Swat, simply because Swat is very far away from the border. Now, these drone attacks have been a mixed blessing in the sense that they have certainly eliminated several dozen Taliban and Al-Qaeda mid-level leaders. But at the same time, they have increased anti-Americanism in Pakistan, and they have certainly increased anti-Americanism and recruiting for the Taliban in the tribal areas. Because along with killing these militants, obviously ordinary people, civilians die as well. Women and children are also being killed in fairly significant numbers. So this is a policy that has enormous drawbacks. And as you know, the Pakistan government, etc., have been privately, I think they have kind of agreed to this happening, given the fact that they themselves are unable or unwilling to kill these leaders. But publicly, it's a very severe embarrassment. Now, the key issue right now for Pakistan, the immediate issue, is trying to resolve this political crisis at home. Unfortunately, our political, Pakistan really lacks leadership at the moment. Leadership that deals with the two critical issues, which are terrorism and the economy. Rather than that, the leaders are fighting each other and involved in this kind of interscene political infighting. There has been enormous American pressure and British and Western pressure to try and get Nawaz Sharif and Asif Zardari to stop this and to come to some kind of accommodation. But frankly, I don't think it's going to happen. And we may, by middle of March, be really met with an impasse when this march takes place on Islamabad by the opposition and they stage a sit-in, or the government reacts by arresting hundreds of people and jailing and firing on the opposition march, etc. There could be a major political blow-up in the country. The second issue is the economic crisis. Well, this administration is committed to asking Congress for something like $1.5 billion a year for the next 5 years for the social sector. Now, there's a very poor record of aid to Pakistan on both sides, both from the American side and from the Pakistani side. The Bush administration gave something like $11.8 billion to the Musharraf regime between 2001 and 2007. 80% of that went to the military. And most of that aid was used not to provide equipment to the forces fighting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban on the Afghan border. Most of it went to buy weapons against India. The army was buying submarines and frigates and F-16s, which were hardly ever going to be used, along the Afghan border. And apart from that, almost nothing was given to the social sector, which was in dire need. Infrastructure, education, health, none of that aid really reached, very, very small amounts reached the social sector. Now, and the third part of this is this whole aid process, both from the Bush administration and from the Pakistani side, was totally unaccountable, and it was totally untransparent. And Congress is, in fact, now trying to go through the bills and see, the process started at the end of the Bush term, when it became so embarrassing for the Bush administration that so much of this money was unaccountable, that this money was being given to the military and there was no account as to where the military was using it and what it was using it for. So I think that this new money, which the Congress is going to pass, there are going to be several problems here. The first problem are, clearly, Congress is going to set some conditions for this aid. It's not going to be for free. We know certainly two of the conditions are going to be that Pakistan remains committed to fighting extremists on its territory and along the border with Afghanistan, and that democracy remains, a democratic form of government remains, and the army does not launch another coup. But the problem here is that with this political mayhem in Pakistan right now, there's going to be a lot of criticism from within Congress about, is it going to be wise, is it safe to give Pakistan so much money, especially when the government is not acting responsibly, it is not providing due accountability, it is not providing due transparency for this money. So there's going to be a lot of congressional opposition. Secondly, this money is going to be taking a very long time to come, because by the time it goes through the whole US legislative process, it could take up to 6 months to a year. And in the meantime, Pakistan is really bankrupt at the moment. And without American commitment, and without an American commitment of money, other donors, the Europeans, the Japanese, and other major donors who have traditionally given to Pakistan are probably not going to step forward. There is a meeting in April of the donors for Pakistan, and there's much talk in Pakistan about how many billions of dollars are going to be coming. But frankly, given the political crisis in the country and given the lack of faith that the international community has right now with the leadership in Pakistan, it's going to be very difficult to see major pledges being made at this time. So I think, what certainly is needed from the Obama administration is some kind of financial help, emergency help. I'm not an expert on the US legislative process, but some kind of emergency help is desperately needed, which could trigger other donors also putting some money into the pot for Pakistan, so it does not default on its foreign debt, and that it can basically pay off some of its immediate bills. We have a real 40% of industry shut down at the moment. There's no power, literally. In December, major cities were suffering from 18 hours of no electricity a day. Why is there no power? There are not enough power stations, but the government did not have money to pay the fuel bill for the power stations. So, the government in December and January actually did not have enough money to pay the salaries of the army and the bureaucracy. And these were paid 2 months late. So, you really are talking about a very, very serious crisis. So the option, I think, there is to give money. Now, the third option is, the third policy is what to do with the military and this whole issue of counterinsurgency. Now, during the last 1 year, the US military has been trying very hard to convince the Pakistan army to retrain some of its units, some of its army divisions for counterinsurgency, so that they could be used more effectively against the militants in northern Pakistan. And the army has refused, simply, because it says the army's logic has been that the main threat is the threat that we face in Pakistan is coming from India, and for India we need a conventional army that fights a conventional war with India on the plains of Punjab, not in the mountains of the tribal areas in Waziristan. So there's been enormous reluctancy to retrain and re-equip the army for counterinsurgency. Instead, the army chief has given a paramilitary force, the Frontier Corps, for some retraining in counterinsurgency. But the Frontier Corps, it's a weak force, it's not properly equipped, and it's a very controversial force because it has been very deeply involved in supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan during the 1990s. What is needed are regular divisions of the Pakistan army. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think for the Obama administration, I think one of the very big things is how do you convince the Pakistan army to move away from this kind of single-minded obsession with India and to understand that the real threat is now a domestic threat of militancy inside Pakistan. I think that the army does understand this, does realize this, but is extremely reluctant to give up the Indian threat, and many would call it a bogey. Because the fact of the matter is that we have one of the largest militaries in the world. It is a military that is kept in place. It takes a huge chunk of resources and the budget. It has a huge economic stake in the country. It owns factories and banks and housing estates and property. And the raison d'etre for all this is that the army is needed to combat India. And clearly the logic would be that, if India is no longer such a threat, well then, why do we need such a large army? And even the question could well be raised as to why we need nuclear weapons. And of course, that is also one of the very big problems with, there's enormous doubt in international capitals, not just in Washington, but all over the world, about Pakistan's nuclear weapons and the safety of those nuclear weapons. Now, those nuclear weapons have been under the control of the military. I mean, I don't believe that they're in any way threatened at the moment or that things could leak out or anything like that right now. But certainly if the Taliban were to spread across the country, and the Taliban are, a reflection in a way of social forces inside the country, these same social forces are also part of the army. And you cannot, the appeal of anti-Americanism, sympathy for the Taliban is there in the military. So there is unless we are able to push back the Taliban and re-establish state control over the whole country, the danger of Talibanism, if you like, or sympathy for the Taliban spreading in the military is very much there. So I think one of the key tasks for this administration is going to be how do you use a mixture of carrot and stick to move Pakistan away from from India. And the key to that, obviously, has to be to bring the Indians on board. And here I'm going to now just talk very briefly about this idea of a regional strategy. Let me I don't know how long I've got. Let me just start by saying that the war has spread in this region. The Taliban have spread, and surely it made logical sense 2 or 3 years ago that if the war has spread, the Afghanistan alone, you cannot resolve Afghanistan without having a strategic geopolitical policy within this region, this is the basic theme of this article that I wrote in Foreign Affairs in December. And what is needed is basically for this administration to adopt a regional strategy. Now, I think they're moving very fast to that. We've seen some really encouraging signs. They've invited all the regional countries, some of the regional countries to Washington to confer about this new policy direction. Hillary Clinton has now called for a big meeting in March before the NATO summit, in which Iran is going to be invited for the first time in talks about securing Afghanistan and stabilizing Afghanistan. So certainly this administration I think, has understood this and is certainly moving towards this. Now, what do we mean by regional strategy? Well, first of all, as I said, Afghanistan is surrounded by 6 neighbors who have constantly interfered in Afghanistan. So at the first level of this regional strategy is you have to get these neighbors to stop interference in Afghanistan. Now that means persuading the Pakistan military to give up on these Afghan Taliban who are living in Pakistan, persuading Iran, the Central Asian republics, Russia, who are also involved in backing this or that faction inside Afghanistan, from doing so. And getting the regional countries to really help stabilize Afghanistan. So at one level of diplomatic activity, there would be a regional initiative which would include basically the big powers and the 6 neighbors of Afghanistan, with Afghanistan. But these regional countries are not going to come together and help the international effort in Afghanistan unless you resolve some of their bilateral issues. Now, I gave you the example of Pakistan and India. The Pakistanis say, well, why the hell should we go and help you in Afghanistan when our real enemy is India? Which means what? You have to then sit down and try and help resolve the Kashmir issue. Now, so the second level of diplomatic activity has to be to start a resolution of bilateral issues in the region. That means primarily India and Pakistan have to come back to the negotiating table. And perhaps with international pressure and support, both countries have to try and move towards some kind of resolution of Kashmir. Iran is critical. And this administration has to have a dialogue. And one thing, one has suggested is that there are so many issues with Iran that perhaps it would be beneficial if the US were to make several baskets of issues with Iran. Now, perhaps the easiest basket to deal with Iran would be Afghanistan. Iran does not like the Taliban. These are Sunni extremists who are helping Sunni extremists in Iran. The Iranian regime has never, who are very, and the Taliban are also very anti-Shia. So the Iranians have never liked the Taliban. So it would be relatively easy, perhaps, for the Americans to talk to Iran and to get some kind of support from Iran in stabilizing Afghanistan. And perhaps a similar process, as you know, at a low level has started in Iraq. Perhaps that also could be stepped up. But other major issues with Iran, the nuclear issue, Iran's rejection of Israel, Iran's support for groups in the Middle East, etc., etc. I mean, these could be part of another basket of issues, which could perhaps be slowly dealt with, but Afghanistan could be dealt properly. Central Asia. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan are neighbors to Afghanistan. And all these three countries have really been left out. But the Bush administration had no strategic policy towards Central Asia whatsoever. It had bases, it used them for renditions and for disappearances and for, torturing suspects of Al-Qaeda, etc. But there was really no strategic policy for Central Asia. Now, Central Asia is not an easy place either. There are very repressive regimes there, horrible regimes there, which have been conducting all sorts of, human rights abuses. There's been very little political and economic reform in Central Asia, etc. But this administration needs to adopt a more holistic approach to Central Asia. You have to get them involved in Afghanistan, and you have to also provide them some kind of aid. They're going through a monumental economic crisis also because of the present, global crisis. And they're going to need some kind of bailout. So the Central Asians need to be involved. And on the wider spectrum, obviously you have to deal with Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. Russia, of course, is playing hard to get. Russia just now has persuaded the Kyrgyz government to kick the Americans out of the base that they have in Kyrgyzstan. But at the same time, Russia is offering railway convoys for American materials that are needed for American troops in Russia. So again, perhaps Afghanistan could be put into a separate basket with Russia, apart from the other strategic issues that the Americans have with Russia, like missile deployment and expansion of NATO into the former Soviet republics and other issues. China, I think, was much ignored by the Bush administration, despite the fact that China could be an enormous asset in Afghanistan. China needs raw materials. Afghanistan is full of raw materials, metals and all sorts of other things. China has just concluded the largest investment deal in Afghanistan to develop a copper mine, which could see something like $3 billion coming into Afghanistan over the next 10 years. Now, China could become a major exploiter of Afghan minerals. Now, and if it does so, obviously, along with that would come roads and jobs and construction and all the rest of it, which would be of great benefit to the Afghan economy. But China has to be brought onto the table. China has to be made part of the decision-making process on Afghanistan. And I think, this administration will want to reach out to China so that it's not that China will be presented with a fait accompli policy, but that China will be brought into the equation of policy making as to which way to go. So this is the second, level of diplomacy. The third level is that you need a regional economic plan. If you look at the borders of Afghanistan, you will see that on this side, on the Pakistan side, the worst and most depressed areas of Pakistan are the tribal areas of Pakistan. And exactly the same is on the other side, on the Afghan side. The worst, literacy rate, health rate, the worst development, the worst roads, all the indicators are the worst. And so what is needed is you cannot have an aid program for Afghanistan that stops somehow at this mythical Pakistan border, which the Pashtun tribes actually don't recognize at all, because they cross and recross every day, all the time, because they've got cousins there, part of the tribe lives on the other side, they've got business on the other side, whatever. So we need a regional economic plan that will link Pakistan's tribal areas with the Afghan border provinces where the same tribes basically live. And if you follow the map around, you hit Tajikistan, southern Tajikistan, and southern Uzbekistan. These are the two worst affected areas with the downturn in Central Asia. This area is, honestly, today is probably poorer even than Afghanistan. There is so little economic activity, and this is where the Central Asian militant groups are drawing their recruits from. So you need an economic plan that extends from northern Afghanistan into southern Central Asia, which links these two regions up. Now, there has been some effort made by the Bush administration with Tajikistan. But, it needs to be done in a much more holistic way right across southern Central Asia so that you are able to link up northern and western Afghanistan with southern Central Asia. So what we need is certainly a regional economic development plan. And I'm very glad that the administration has now asked the World Bank and the IMF to be looking at this. All the development agencies are also looking at this. Even though such ideas have been around, I mean, these were again, if you read Descent into Chaos, you'll see that these ideas were being promoted back in 2001 to the Americans, but were completely ignored. So we need a diplomatic initiative. We need an economic regional initiative. Now, what do the Americans really, part of this is that you're not going to get all this for nothing. The Americans need to give something also. Now, very simply, in trying to put together this regional initiative, I think there are 4 or 5 things the Americans will have to concede. The first thing is that Afghan soil, and I hope Iraq soil, you need a pledge from the Americans that Afghan soil will not be used to attack Iran. This is the very basic demand of the Iranians at the moment. And if that pledge can be repeated from Iraq, that Iraqi soil will not be used by American forces in Iraq or in Afghanistan to undermine or attack Iran. In other words, to do regime change in Iran. And of course, this would be a repudiation of the whole Bush agenda of regime change, etc., for Iran. So I think that's the first thing you'd have to do. The second thing to assure the Russians would be that you would have to give some kind of guarantees that the American bases in Central Asia are not there for all time to come. They would be there only for as long as they are needed to fight the war in Afghanistan. That the US is not seeking permanent bases in Central Asia. Certainly, this is something that the Russians are looking for, a public, a long-term commitment that this would be the case. Thirdly, you would need to involve China in your decision-making process. This is something that has really not happened, I mean, apart from North Korea. This really needs to happen across this region. China, of course, would also be a huge boon in helping relations with Pakistan, because China is a key ally of Pakistan. It's a key investor in Pakistan. And China could help an Obama policy in Pakistan also, as could Saudi Arabia for that matter. And fourthly, I think you really need an assurance that can only come with this aid package to Pakistan, that the US is not going to abandon Pakistan in the short term. That the moment the Al-Qaeda threat is over, the Taliban are beaten back, or whatever, that the US will just walk away from Pakistan. I think there's a very strong feeling in the military, in the establishment, that this is what has always happened. If you look at the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, the US walked away from Pakistan, abandoned it, if you like, abandoned Afghanistan, of course, also. I think the Pakistani establishment is looking for some kind of long-term commitment. It just does not trust the Americans. It believes that the Americans are using Pakistan for its short-term interests in the region, and certainly that was the impression given to the Pakistanis by the Bush administration. Finally, let me say, I think a huge change has come about with this administration simply by, for the first time, we are seeing in our region the policy and the public diplomacy is being shaped by American civilians. That is, the State Department is back in the saddle. The departments of US government, unfortunately what we saw in the Bush administration, sitting in Islamabad or Kabul, that the main players was the Pentagon and the US military. And the Pentagon comes with all its sort of baggage. It comes with a certain vision of how it sees things. It sees things, obviously, in a military fashion. It doesn't see things just in the broader context. And I think what we've seen with this administration, most importantly in our part of the world, I mean, the joke in Islamabad simply was that, well, you accuse us of being, Musharraf being a military regime. Well, all we see of you guys are your generals. You must have a military regime in America also. And so for the first time, we're actually seeing civilians. The administration has appointed Richard Holbrooke as the main interlocutor. He has put together an interagency team, which is being drawn from all the departments, from State Department, the National Security Council, the CIA, from Treasury, from the military also. But Petraeus is number 2, in fact, is part of this Richard Holbrooke's team. So you have a team that is being led by civilians with that necessary broader policy grasp, if you like, of what needs to be done, not just looking at it in the narrow focus of, Al-Qaeda, terrorism, military tactics, military strategy, but looking at it in the full context of aid and politics and finance and all the rest of it. So let me just end by saying that I think this administration has made the right start. Now, I will just end by saying, of course, everything is going to be held hostage to the economic crisis that you are going through right now. Everything that I've stated here needs money. And there's going to be increasing unwillingness of the American public to contribute more and more money to this, to this region. And that's why it's even more important that this regional strategy really takes off. Because there are people out there with money. The Chinese have money, for example, and so do the Arabs. So at least some of the Arabs do. And these countries have to be enlisted into this regional support. So the economic burden and the financial burden does not just fall on the United States and on Europe. So I'm hopeful that certainly there are very tough times ahead. And what is going to be very difficult is for this administration to sell this to the American people as a long-term strategy. Because both for Pakistan and Afghanistan, there has to be a long-term strategy. This is not going to be over in a year or two. It could have been over in a few years back in 2001 if the right policies had been pursued. But this is not going to be over in a year or two now. And do the American people, and does this and other administrations after this have the willpower and the willingness to stick with it? Because that's what's needed. Thank you very much.
Our speakers agreed to entertain questions for a few minutes. There are 2 microphones. If you have a question to put to Ahmed Rashid, please come to a microphone. And while people are walking forward, I want to, because of a lot of experience at Stanford, make a distinction between a question, which is a straightforward question, and a counter thesis. We'd like to get to the question, so if you have a thesis, it had better be able to be expressed in 1 sentence, and then the question. I don't mean to sound so harsh, but we do want to hear the questions. We want to hear different points of view. Let's start here.
Hi, would you please elaborate on the nature of the internal political divisions in Pakistan, and also whether you think that's an area that U.S. policy could influence in pushing for either a reconciliation government or for one side or the other to triumph, or whether that needs to be an entirely homegrown solution?
Right. The elections last year delivered a divided polity, in that the control at the center was won by Benazir Bhutto's party, the People's Party. Control in Punjab, the largest province in the country with 60% of the population and 80% of the army, was won by the major opposition leader, Nawaz Sharif. Now, ostensibly, they had an alliance, but it's taken a year to unravel. And there have been constant bouts of tension between the two. And now it has completely unraveled, with the Nawaz Sharif's brother being disqualified and thrown out as chief minister of the Punjab. The Sharifs have enlisted the lawyers' movement on their side. Now, the lawyers' movement is another very complicated issue, but essentially it goes back to Musharraf's last months in office when he sacked the top judiciary for fear that they may give a judgment against him in continuing as president. And the lawyers came out into the streets against Musharraf, and they were joined by almost virtually, all of middle-class society in the country, and that led to the toppling of Musharraf. The Chief Justice has still not been restored by the People's Party government, which is complicated, but basically because Asif Zardari, the president, fears that the amnesty that was given to him and others on corruption cases so that he could become president would be withdrawn from the Chief Justice, who's now coming back. But what has happened is that the lawyers' movement has itself divided. And half the lawyers are now with the People's Party, and the other half are still with the opposition and are demanding the restoration of the Chief Justice. So it's a very complicated issue, and people are fed up. I mean, I was in Lahore the day of this attack in Lahore, and you can't imagine, that very same day, instead of grieving with the Sri Lankan cricketers and with the people of Lahore, both Asif Zardari and Nawaz Sharif were slamming each other. And that was what was on the front page of the papers next day. So it's very sad. Clearly, I don't know if the carrot of American aid and substantial aid from foreign countries is going to be enough to bring these two together. But I fear not. I think this is going to be played out in March, certainly this month, and perhaps it will turn very nasty. And of course, what many people fear is that ultimately this is going to bring the army back. Because if there is a complete political paralysis, political impasse, the politicians are not able to resolve this problem. There's going to be pressure from a section of the public, the business community, and others. There's going to be pressure from within the army for the army chief to step in again. And what that is going to be is also creates its own very dangerous dynamic.
Your writings seem to imply that the societies of Afghanistan and Western Pakistan and the tribal areas of Central Asia, with pacification and security and development from Western aid, could somehow become the civil societies that we would hope that they might, and that this might happen within our lifetimes. Isn't it more realistic to think in terms of several generations for these tribal societies to make that transformation?
Look, Afghanistan and Pakistan are at two different levels of development. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, I certainly believe that what we need to achieve in Afghanistan is exactly what you're saying. We're not going to be able to achieve that level of development. What we need to achieve in Afghanistan is the development of what I call a minimalist state. That minimalist state existed throughout the 20th century until the Soviet invasion in 1979. Now, and what do I mean by that? I mean essentially there was a center which had an army, a small army, a bureaucracy, which was subsidized by the British in India initially, then by the Americans, and then by the Soviets. But it effectively did have, there was a center which effectively did control the provinces with a very minimal kind of apparatus, state apparatus. There was a police force, an army, and a bureaucracy, but a very minimal kind. There was a minimum of trade, there was exports, but again, Afghanistan was never a big industrial country or anything like that. If we can try and recreate that minimalist, and there was a minimal infrastructure that provided the means for the state to assert its authority. In other words, there was a minimum network of roads, there was electricity in the cities, not in the countryside, but at least in the cities. If we can resurrect that minimalist state, which is not a big deal. I mean, we're not asking here for the level of development for in Iraq, for example, or even the level of development that exists in Pakistan. I think that is very doable within the next 5 to 10 years. I think that is what should have been done after 9/11. If that had been the goal of the Bush administration, I think we wouldn't be in the mess that we are today. And that goal would have meant a commitment of $5 to $6 billion a year for about 5 years to recreate this minimum infrastructure. Now, Pakistan is a much more developed country. Pakistan has classes, it has ethnic groups, it has industry, it had enormous state control by the police and by the army, much of which it has lost, in recent months. But in Pakistan, for the first time, we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years the real development of a civil society. I mean, that civil society was responsible for getting rid of Musharraf. Now, so I think in Pakistan, we can set our goals a little higher. But in Pakistan, it's going to take, again, the next 3 to 4 years to bail Pakistan out of the present economic mess and to bail Pakistan out of the Taliban threat. So perhaps even in Pakistan, we need to set a kind of slightly lower goals than we would have a year or two ago. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I'm a firm believer that, Afghanistan, there's no need to develop Afghanistan as a modern third world country. That is going to take generations. But I think you have to provide a minimalist state structure so that jobs and security are provided.
Can we stay on this side since he's been standing here quite a while?
Thank you for your time, sir. You talk a lot about the importance of the counterinsurgency strategy, but I want to ask you, do you really think with a reinforcement of up to only 60,000 U.S. troops that we can really implement this strategy, or do you foresee alternative arrangements that we can accrue enough security resources to bring stability that we need?
Well, I think the real counterinsurgency strategy is going to be waged by the Afghan army. Those are the forces that are going to actually, if the Americans are going to clear the insurgents, the holding operation and the security and stabilization operation is going to be done by the Afghan army. Now, there's a move now to double the size of the Afghan army. This was one of the big mistakes. For the first 3 years, the Bush administration gave hardly any emphasis on building the Afghan army, or the police for that matter. Which was just, the Afghan army and police have only really started being built up from 2004, 2005. If this process had started after 9/11, we would be in a different situation now. So certainly we need American troops, we need NATO troops to do some of the mentoring and the leadership and the clearing, etc. But eventually the task is going to fall on the Afghan army. And all the reports of the Afghan army are that they are performing extremely well. It is the only real structure in the entire country, if you look at the justice or bureaucracy, which is really functioning properly. But they're going to need time. They don't have heavy weapons, they don't have an air force, they don't have all sorts of things that they're going to need to get in the next few years.
Thank you. Given that the Afghans have never accepted a foreign occupation, don't you think that there's some benefit to a certain level of jihadi violence against the Afghan public so that the U.S. and other foreign militaries have a pretext to maintain a presence in Afghanistan?
Sorry, that there's relevance to jihad against the Americans. Is that what you're saying?
No, if there's a certain level of jihadi violence against the Afghan public, then it gives the U.S. and other foreign militaries a pretext to maintain a presence in Afghanistan, because the pretext would be we're protecting you from the jihadis.
Sorry, I'm really dim here. I'm not really understanding your question, but look, if you're saying that the war is providing in Americans the excuse to stay on in Afghanistan, no, certainly not. I don't think the Americans want to be in Afghanistan one day more than they have to be. That was the reason being given about the staying on in Iraq. That we're going to the Americans want to grab Iraqi oil and all the rest of it. I think the Americans want to be out of Afghanistan as soon as they possibly can hand over to the Afghan army and an efficient Afghan government.
Okay, just to follow up, have you read the Rand Corporation study on how terrorist groups end? the study that they did on
Yeah,
650.
through negotiations, yes, yes. Well, I mean, I've been in favor of, as I said earlier on, talking to elements of the Taliban. I have to be part of the counterinsurgency strategy, dividing the Taliban between the sort of Al-Qaeda-linked Taliban and the Taliban who are not, who don't have global jihad agendas. It has to be part of the strategy. And I'm very glad President Obama has talked about this just 2 days ago.
I think we really only have time for 2 more questions. I don't want people to stand up for a long time, so if I can have your question and your question.
You mentioned that as part of the regional strategy, the US could or should try to improve relations between India and Pakistan. Why do you think they really haven't made a serious effort to do that yet? And are the armies of one or both countries responsible to ensure that that does not happen?
Look, let me tell you, this piece on regional strategy that I wrote, the only real objections that came to this piece were from the Indian Foreign Ministry and the Indian media, who said that I'm trying to link Kashmir with Afghanistan, and I'm trying to equate India with Pakistan. Now look, and almost every other country that I had feedback from, China, Iran, they've all endorsed the idea of a regional strategy. Even Iran has. India is objecting to it. India feels that negotiations with Pakistan are a bilateral issue and it has nothing to do with Afghanistan. The point of the issue, one of the critical problems right now is that India and Pakistan are today playing out their rivalry, not in Kashmir necessarily. They're playing out their rivalry in Afghanistan. There's an Indian presence in Afghanistan, which the Pakistanis think is detrimental, and the Pakistanis think the Indians there are trying to undermine Pakistan. Consequently, there's a constant beat of attacks by the Taliban on Indian engineers and Indian embassy and Indian civilian workers and all the rest of it. Now, this is a terrible situation. And so in fact, the Kashmir dispute has now been kind of shifted to Kabul. And I sometimes say, Kabul is the new Kashmir. So rather than contain our conflicts, we are expanding the breadth and the territory over which our rivalries and conflicts are happening. And this is not beneficial to anyone, neither the peoples of the two countries or the international community or anyone else. I think the Indians should understand that, unless they wake up to the reality of Pakistan, really a very serious potential of a meltdown in Pakistan. India may be sharing a border very soon, not with Pakistan, but with the Taliban. That is, the Taliban occupying parts of Pakistan along the Indian border. And what kind of threat would that pose to India? So I'm really pushing the fact that, I think there is a crying need for negotiations. Now, it's a very complicated thing. There's a rivalry in Afghanistan, which has not been touched upon by the two countries. And certainly the Obama administration needs to start a dialogue between India and Pakistan on their rivalry in Afghanistan. There is also the demand from India, which is totally justifiable, that these jihadi groups who've been fighting in Kashmir need to be not just jailed temporarily, but need to be put away in the long term. Need to be demobilized and need to be, really put down. Not in a repressive way, but need to be demobilized with a proper program. That is not happening, because the Pakistan army still believes that by maintaining these jihadi groups form the front line of any potential next war with India. So, this is a vicious circle that will just go on and on and on. I think this has to be broken. And India is the larger power. India is the more successful power, if you like. India does face a threat from a meltdown in Pakistan. Obviously, a lot of onus rests on Pakistan and the military and breaking up these jihadi groups. But, we have to begin somewhere. The Mumbai massacre, in a sense, it served all the hardliners on both sides it served. The attack in Mumbai, the Indians were, the Indian hardliners in the BJP and all were saying, we should bomb Pakistan, we should attack Pakistan, we should not talk to Pakistan. And the hardliners in Pakistan were saying, great, I mean, this will force the Indians to give us Kashmir. And hardliners were whipping up a kind of frenzy in Pakistan. I mean, this is not the way to go. As long as both countries are going to be held hostage by extremist factions who can derail, if the extremists are going to be allowed to derail the peace process at every time and at every moment, I mean, then we're in deep trouble. Then we are not real states operating with real proper foreign policies and reconciliation.
You mentioned that apart from the other steps that the US administration needs to take, it needs a regional strategy. It needs to engage Russia on access through Central Asia into Afghanistan, Iran on stabilizing Afghanistan, address some of the other concerns that Iran has. So I'm just wondering, how can the US administration gather up so much political capital that apart from addressing the security situation, the instability within Pakistan and stabilizing Afghanistan, it gives a lot of IOUs or quid pro quos to all these powers whose interest is also in Afghan stability. They should be stepping up to the table themselves without needing anything in return from the United States.
Well, history has shown us that they're not doing that. History has shown us that they have done everything to destabilize Afghanistan. History has also shown us that their bilateral problems have blocked any real attempt at a regional support for stabilizing Afghanistan. So I know what I'm suggesting is very complicated, and the classic thing. I mean, Americans can't chew gum and walk at the same time, and they can't do more than one thing at the same time. Here, what we're trying to say is that, look, you've got to fight a war in Afghanistan, you've got to stabilize Pakistan, and then you've got to talk to all these countries to also help stabilize the whole region. I think it's doable. And actually, I think this administration, even beset as it is with the economic crisis, it has started on that way. I mean, look what's happening in the next few weeks. You're going to have you're starting a dialogue with Iran, which will be on Afghanistan, which will be this meeting at the end of March. There is talk. There is a whole dialogue, a new dialogue, be going on with Russia. Reset the button, as Joe Biden said. And Russia is now accommodating the American supply of military materials to Afghanistan. There is a serious dialogue starting with China on Afghanistan. The visits by US officials recently, Afghanistan has been the #1 topic of conversation. Holbrooke, despite being told by the Indians that, at many different levels and layers, because this is the only way you're going to try and put together a policy that is going to stabilize the region. And I think it's happening. I think you've got some very competent people. You've got Hillary Clinton, Richard Holbrooke, Dennis Ross, people like that, who are old hands at the region and who are certainly, I think, have grasped the mettle of this, the need for a regional solution.
I will not expand upon your applause with any further comments except to say thank you for coming to Stanford and thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you.